Welcome to the 26th Grieve School. Some old friends, who've been to many of the schools, and it's great to see you all again. The exit, there was an exit at the back in the event of something unexpected happening, and the lane is right out through the door at the end. Or you can go out through the door you come in through. So, two choices. We're beginning with something unusual, something we've never begun with before, in that Jared Humphreys has... Jared Humphreys has written a play called Friendly Fire, and it's appropriate, I suppose, given the subject matter we're discussing this evening, and that an excerpt from the play will be performed. Tony Graham, who, as you know, as you probably know, is editor of History Ireland, and as I said to him earlier, started a small industry when he founded historical walking tours here in Dublin, and I'm delighted that Tommy agreed to come along and chair this session.
To welcome you all to this first session of the 26th Desmond Grieve Summer School. I was very impressed with the way the lads got that stuff erected there. Next time I've got some flat furniture, I know who to contact. Now, the topic under discussion here this evening is the ideology of Remembrance, Ireland and the First World War. And we have two speakers to address this topic. I've Michael Quinn here, who's all set to give the first presentation. Each speaker will give about half an hour. Half an hour, guys? Okay. And Michael, of course, has just completed a doctorate in Irish-Soviet relations, and he was chair of the James Connolly Initiative, and he's currently specialising on Ireland and the First World War. Brian Hanley, of course, is the author of The Lost Revolution, co-author along with Scott Miller. Brian, of course, has had a long association with History Ireland, both the magazine and the Head Schools, the live show. So without further ado, I'll just let Michael then to give the first presentation, and we'll open it up to the floor then after both speakers.
To begin, colleagues and friends, I wish to thank the organisers for the opportunity to present some of my ideas on this important topic. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Important not just in terms of a contribution to the discourse taking place around the anniversaries of the First World War, but as a contribution to the Desmond Grieve School of Thought. The growing power of the EU and NATO in this era of globalization of transnational capitalism can best be checked by citizens working together to defend the best traditions of the nation state, including independent foreign policy formulation. Now, this is the title of my topic. I think you've had a chance to have a read of it. And as you can probably see there, I'm linking the issue of remembrance of the First War with the issue of Irish foreign policy. And you may ask, why have I focused on the War Memorial Gardens? And I can tell you that I did so because of this following piece of text that appeared in the History Ireland special issue on the First War, wherein Tomás Irish of TCD wrote a review concerning Jason Myers' The Great War and Memory in Irish Culture, 1918-2010. And he wrote as follows: as the centenary of the outbreak approaches, scholarly and popular interest has focused not only on the Irish experience of war, but also on how the participation of over 200,000 Irishmen was marginalised in official and popular memory in subsequent decades. And he concluded on that point, the Irish National War Memorial Gardens at Island Bridge are frequently cited as a defining example of this alleged, my word, historical neglect. So that's what's behind my selection of the gardens, and I now move us on to this is how I plan to present to you my ideas on the topic. I'm going to talk about the committee, the National National War Memorial Committee, who initiated the gardens from the committee's founding in 1919 up to the completion of gardens in 1939. And then I'm going to talk about the impact of Irish foreign policy on the gardens from 1939, with a focus on some of my research, a brief focus on my research into Irish-Soviet relations from the 1970s, and a couple of observations on the present day. And I want to give you a little warning, if I may, for you. I intend to introduce, in the form of a postscript, something of a little challenge here. And if you'll pardon this terrible pun, I hope to plant a seed about the possibility of an Irish international peace garden being brought about in Dublin. Now, the initiation of the War Gardens began in July 1919 in the Vice-Regal Lodge, now known as Oras an Uachtaráin, where a select meeting of approximately 100 Irishmen was assembled. The initiative was characterised by those present, which included a strong British Army officer cohort, some big house notables, the Lords Mayor of Belfast and Londonderry, the province of TCD, and Captain Dixon, who later became a minister at Stormont. Now at this stage, July 1919, the War of Independence was just getting underway, and the initiative chose for its first president this man here, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Viscount of Ypres, Field Marshal John French. And just a few biographical details on French, and all my biographical details from there, just to let you know, are drawn from the Dictionary of Irish Biography. At the outbreak of the war, French was Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF. A field officer with little staff experience, he was increasingly seen as incompetent by his fellow officers. Regarded by some as the stereotypical donkey general on the Western Front, French was later lampooned as such in the musical and film Oh What a Lovely War. In December 1915, French resigned his command of the BEF. As a consolation, it seems, he was given the honorary title of First Viscount of Ypres after the Belgian town that stood in the way of German advance into France. And he was also appointed Lieutenant of Ireland, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Immediately faced by a coalition of Sinn Féin, the Labour movement, and the Catholic bishops, he failed to implement conscription in Ireland. A key turning point against support for the war and for the outcome of the 1918 general election. The appointment of this military man as Lord Lieutenant was widely seen as heralding an iron fist policy. However, the futility of such a policy was highlighted a few months after he had convened the memorial meeting. And here's a short little note. French's car was ambushed at Kelly's Corner, Fisborough, by an IRA squad commanded by Dan Breen. French survived, but he was soon replaced, in fact, in April 21, as part of preparation for peace moves that led to the treaty. Now, at the same meeting, the following executive committee was elected. And apart from some people who passed away over the next 20 years, most of the members continued on the committee until the gardens were built. Now, I'm going to talk about two in particular, but just to mention, there's two women there, Lady Arnott, who you may have heard of, and who had lost a son in the war, and Hermione Wilson, who was the secretary. And like all good committees, and I'm sure we've all served on all good committees, She was a very able secretary, as can be detected from the archive, from the committee's archive, which are now housed in Dublin City Library and Archive at the other end of Pearse Street. Anyway, I want to mention two in particular. General Hickey, he was a commander of the 16th Irish Division, and he later became a Free State Senator. And he had been chosen for this position on the Irish Brigade because he was known as a home ruler, a Catholic, and he was acceptable to Redmond. The second guy, though, is particularly interesting, and in fact, you could say he was the main man on the committee, Andrew Jemison. Chairman of John Jemison and Company, and Governor of the Bank of Ireland, serving until 1941, Jemison had previously been a leading light in Irish unionism. Therein he supported a position of accepting the inevitability of Home Rule, so that prominent unionists would be able to influence its makeup. During the War of Independence, Jemison was consulted widely by both the provisional government and the British government. As president of the Dublin Chamber of Commerce in 1922, he represented not only the political minority, but also Irish banking and business interests. Now, as we know, the Free State, led by the most conservative of revolutionaries, took on the British model of Parliament, the legal system, the civil service, and banking. In the 20s and 30s, Bank of Ireland retained its status as the Free State's largest bank, and its conservative monetarist policies fitted in with those of W.T. Cosgrave's government. As a senator at this time, he became a strong supporter of Cum na nGaedheal. And I'm going to give you now an extract from John M. Regan's publication, The Irish Counter-Revolution. Regan cites from a memoir of James A. Burke, who was a minister in Cosgrave's government, from a cabinet meeting in 1923, just before the general election, as follows. When the question of finance arose, Cosgrave announced that Andrew Jackson had assured him that on certain ministers being retained in the incoming government, there would be sufficient funds available to fight the election. And consequently, obviously, he was well placed to promote his cause for a memorial garden. Now, 15 different schemes were considered by the Memorial Committee after they had collected £50,000 in a public appeal, and for which they received donations large and small. I'll just mention two of the schemes which failed. Number 11, the removal of Nelson's pillar, and, listen to this, then to erect a memorial of more reasonable height. Have we got that today? But perhaps it was the outcome of proposal number 14 on Merrion Square was the most revealing for historians. That project got as far as the Free State Senate, but was in 1927 rejected by the Cosgrave government. Interestingly, in John Cooney's biography of Archbishop John Charles McQuaid, Cooney states that McQuaid's predecessor, Archbishop Edward Byrne, quote, with the secret assistance of the then head of government, Cosgrave, in 1931, Byrne bought Merrion Square from the Pembroke estate for £10,000, specifically for the site of a Notre Dame-style cathedral for Catholic Dublin and Ireland. So it seems that Merrion Square, alongside the seat of government and the Dáil, was considered too close for a war memorial garden, but it would be suitable for state and church. However, Coonley also details how that cosy arrangement was upset by a combination of, wait for it, three people: Big Jim Larkin, an institution, Dublin Corporation, and Eamon de Valera. Larkin called for the square to be thrown open to the public. In 1940, corporation planners wanted the cathedral to be built near the River Liffey, where the offices are now, corporation offices are now. And de Valera indicated to McQuaid that he wished to restrict development of the area and the church would have to find another site. So I think that little bit of information indicates that sometimes the image we're given of de Valera's Ireland being totally dominated by the church, it's not quite true. Anyway, back to the 1920s and the War Gardens. In the aftermath of Colsgray's rejection of the square, and the committee, right, realists at this stage of the new setup recognised that nothing ought to be attempted without the approval of the Irish government, wrote to Cosgrave requesting that they be afforded an appropriate position in the Phoenix Park. Cosgrave responded by proposing a scheme on the south bank of the Liffey. It was to be divided into two parts: the layout of a parkway to stretch from Island Bridge to Chapel Izzard, and the incorporation of a garden of remembrance on a 20-acre plot. 50,000 was to be contributed by the government, and the other 50,000 for the gardens was to be provided by the Memorial Committee. This was happily accepted by the committee, and both parties entered into a legal agreement that the trustees of the memorial, nominated by the committee, would have the exclusive use of the gardens on certain days of the year, and the government would undertake to maintain the garden in perpetuity. And that's a little photo I took with my camera the other day, and that's the plaque on the entrance gates to the garden, confirming that that arrangement is still in operation today. And this particular arrangement, according to Edward Madigan, also in History Ireland, last issue, he makes an interesting observation or point that the Commonwealth, or formerly the Imperial, War Graves Commission, unlike Belgium and France, the Commission owns none of the Irish burial or memorial sites. Now, Edwin Lutyens, the architect of the gardens, was one of the foremost architects of domestic and colonial British Edwardian period. Combining stately architecture and gardens, he was responsible for outstanding commissions in England for landed and state clients. But his most important work was in India, New Delhi, especially the Viceroy's residence, this building on the left, which is now the President of India House. After the First War, he was responsible for many more memorials, including the cenotaph. Andrew Jemison was hailed for securing Lutyens' services. Yet Lutyens was no stranger to Ireland. His mother, Mary Galway, was Irish, and Lutyens' earlier works in Ireland include the restoration and enlargement of the castle at Lambay Island, the alterations to Holt Castle in 1909, Haywood Gardens in Queen's County in 1912, which were owned by Colonel Hutchison Poe, who was one of the attendees in 1919 in the Vice-Regal Lodge. the superintendents, and this is the gardens, this is an aerial view of the gardens. And could I ask at this stage, Chairman, if I may, if I could have an indication of how many people present in the room tonight have actually been in the gardens? Can I have a show of hands, please? Any idea, Tommy, what kind of percentage is that? Is it 50? Yeah? Okay, pretty good number. Pretty good number, I think. Even among this audience. Anyway, the superintendent and staff of the Phoenix Park and Botanic Gardens and the Office of Public Works cooperated with the Memorial Committee in the building of the gardens. Even the wording of the granite pieces was approved by the cabinets, including Deb's cabinets. The work was carried out by 300 men who had served in the British or Irish armies, the majority of whom had served in both. And the British Legion men were assigned here by their employment officer. And in 1942, the committee wrote an account of the building of the gardens. And in that account, the public account, the following I think is worthy of note. It says, "It is worthy of recognition that in the new era and under the vastly changed political conditions, the governments of Mr. Cosgrave and Mr. De Valera recognised the rightness of the motive that prompted the construction of the Memorial Gardens and made their own valued state's contribution to it." Now, because so many of you have been there, I'm not going to give you any architectural journey around the gardens. But I do want to say at this stage, and I want to acknowledge that the excellence of the gardens as a place of remembrance for those members of my own family and my wife's family who were among the Irishmen who died in France in the First War, Lance Corporal Morgan Delaney from Stradbally, and two Dubliners, Privates Edward McQuillan and Thomas Brodie. However, Lutyens' own advice to people who wish to engage with his work, as recorded by Alan Greenberg in a journal article, is pertinent. With reference to his New Delhi buildings, designed to impress the native Indians with the power and grandeur of the Raj's foremost buildings, Lutyens counselled against letting the senses overcome reason. And I quote, "The brain should excite the senses to appreciation, rather than allow the senses and their attendant phrases to placate the mind. Accordingly, it behoves visitors to the gardens to have in mind the context and the imperialist nature of the war, and to have also regard, as Robert Balla so eloquently said on a programme, to have regard for the millions of Germans, Austrians, etc., who were also lost in the war, something for which these gardens were not designed to do, confined as they are to honour the Irish who died in British forces." Now, one thing I do want to just mention about the gardens is this temple on the left, which is located not far from the River Liffey. And there's a piece of poetry which I'm not going to read this evening, but I do have a copy of the wording if anybody wants it. And it's by Rupert Brooke. Now, according to the searches that I made, Rupert Brooke has no connection with Ireland. And this is strange because committee were very proud of the fact that the gardens were Irish. And in fact, I quote, "It is really, truly, and most essentially a national memorial, since the whole nation was united in raising it up. The labour was Irish, etc. But strangely, they chose Brooke for this piece of poetry. One wonders why, as we heard earlier, perhaps, why Francis Ledwidge or Tom Kettle weren't chosen.
I like to tell you.
But later, okay? Thank you. Thank you all the same. And I look forward to that. Now, I just want to show you something here from the archives, and there's no great revelations here, but it is, it just introduces the British Legion, which was behind, if you like, the National War Memorial Garden. Now, General Hickey, who I mentioned earlier, was a leading member of the British Legion, but at the same time, the committee was at a remove. And I just thought you'd be interested in seeing this. And you can read it very well, but you can see who the patron is. Let's put my glasses back on. The patron for the British Legion on the letterhead is the King. Can you read that there at the top? It also says that the letterhead, this is the letterhead for Ireland, southern in brackets area. No mention of the Irish Free State. On the left, you can see Major General Hickey is indicated as the president. You read that, and so on. And here we have the Legion writing to Miss Wilson, Hermione Wilson, the secretary of the War Memorial Committee, and it's dated 1939. And at this stage now, the gardens are complete, and the British Legion are anxious to get in there to continue, in particular to continue their services for Memorial Sunday. All right, and this here is another extract from the archive, and it's a record of a meeting that took place. You'll note in the absence of Andrew Jemison, and the reason for that is Jemison fell out of favour when Fianna Fáil came to power because of the social and financial policy, progressive at its time, which Fianna Fáil had introduced. And Jackson was no longer a senator. But he was ill. I mean, he was genuinely ill at this stage. But he wasn't there, but he certainly was out of favour. But these other people were there. And look at this. Eamon de Valera explained to them that he had postponed the opening of the park because he thought a ceremony such as the British Legion had contemplated was inadvisable with the affairs at present. And of course, look at the date here, May 1939. Yes. A few months, the clouds of war were hovering over Europe. And as we know, de Valera, alongside the emergency, the domestic arrangement for the war, but he was very strict about being seen to be neutral diplomatically, and he wasn't going to open the gardens. And he explained that to them, and look what happens. The trustees expressed complete agreement with this. All right, and then Dev dangles £10,000 before them to do some more work on the gardens. Now actually there was some strings attached to that, but I don't have time to go into that. But you can see that Dev convinces the committee that this is the right course. What's sister said about Dev? You know, negotiating with Dev was like lifting up Mercury with a fork or something. So, and I just mentioned as well, the British Legion actually went to see him as well, and it goes to show that he wasn't. De Valera explained his policies to the committee and the British Legion. You know, it wasn't a dictatorial decision and take it or leave it. I mean, he was very firm, but he did explain his position to these people. Just I get up to date here now. Now I want to move on to the second section of my talk, which is to do with foreign policy. And obviously now, Dev's decision to not open officially the garden was based on his foreign policy. But just like it just focus on the name of the garden, which I believe is something of a misnomer. Firstly, while unstated, it refers to Irishmen who were killed while fighting in the ranks of the British Armed Forces. It doesn't mention the British Army. But more importantly, Ireland as a state, either the Irish Free State or the Irish Republic, has never been at war with any country. And in fact, since our independence, Ireland, based upon our status as a neutral and with a post-colonial past, has earned an enviable reputation for itself as for peacekeeping and other measures at the United Nations. I just want to introduce you to two of Ireland's foreign ministers, Frank Aiken and Gareth Fitzgerald, and I've chosen carefully for their contrasting policies. I mentioned Ireland's peacekeeping, but I'm now going to just draw briefly from my own recent research on Irish-Soviet relations. Less often remembered, perhaps, is Ireland's initiative under Frank Aiken at the UN on international peace, which culminated in the adoption of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It took a sustained effort of 10 years to get the major powers to finalise the treaty. But when it was opened for simultaneous ratification in 1968 by UN members states in Washington, London and Moscow, the Soviet government honoured Aiken and invited him to sign Ireland's endorsement in Moscow, which he duly did. However, when Ireland joined the EEC in 1973, such independent foreign policy initiatives were curtailed. As Foreign Minister, and as indicated by his founding membership of the Irish Council of the European Movement in the 1950s, Dr. Fitzgerald was favourably disposed not just towards Irish membership of the EEC, but also for the adoption of a wholehearted commitment to the process of EEC integration. Such enthusiasm complemented the requirement from 1973 for Irish involvement in what's called European Political Cooperation, EPC, an intergovernmental mechanism whereby the 9 members then in the EC, making of the EC, all of whom, bar Ireland, were members of NATO, agreed to confer with one another and arrive at common EEC foreign policy positions on a consensual basis, whenever possible. Under EPC, Ireland was also required to involve itself in confidential working groups, one of which was focused upon the Soviet Union. In my research, I accessed government files relating to Ireland's involvement on that working group. And suffice to say for now that I will be putting forward evidence when I have secured a publisher that Ireland took part in diplomatic actions which were both ethically and legally questionable. Ireland was also involved in working groups on with the EEC, with its partners, on the United Nations, Africa and the Middle East. At the same time, in other corridors of the EEC power, as set out, as, for example, in Dermot Ferreter's recent study of the 1970s, Ireland secured from the regional funds amounts arising from 8 million in 1975 to over 30 million in 1979. As indicated to me by one of my interviewees, a former senior diplomat, Ireland was involved in managing its relationship within the EEC, i.e., and this is my own phrase, a maximum of pragmatism and a minimum of publicity prevailed. So, to finish this short exercise and to change the change in foreign policy from Aiken to Fitzgerald's time, I wish to observe the trend in requirement, Ireland's requirement to fall in line with the dominant positions in the EEC, now of course the EU. That it has accelerated to the point where last July, Minister Charlie Flanagan abstained in a key vote at the United Nations Human Rights Council on the conflict in Gaza, citing that his move complied with, quote, a collective EU approach to seek more balance for Israel's stance, which, I'm sure you'll agree, effectively gave the green light to continue with Israel's 50-day bombardment. Warlike, World War I warlike, with one difference. There was no women or children or older people in the trenches. Now, you may reasonably wonder at this stage, what's that got to do with the War Memorial Gardens? And so to bring us right back to the gardens, I've here a photo taken in the gardens in 2011 during the visit by the heads of state to the gardens. Here we have, of course, Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary McAleese. Sorry, did I say Queen? Freudian slip, perhaps. But anyway, but to be serious about it, many factors, as you know, because it's all fresh in the mind still, went into the royal visit around the warming of British-Irish relations, the peace process in Northern Ireland, etc. However, the event must also be viewed as part of an EU-wide process that includes the recent gathering of leaders of the former enemies, Belgium, France, Britain and Germany, who have joined together in a peace of reconciliation to commemorate the 100th anniversary. Laudable as these gestures are on one level, they must also be viewed against the major powers' ability to utilise the structures of EU, NATO and at the United Nations to command the support of states such as Ireland in their foreign common policy positions. Evidence for this was also shown at the NATO summit held in Wales 2 weeks ago, where Ireland's Defence Minister, Coveney, represented one of 26 non-NATO countries were present on the fringes of that conference. And now, you'll remember I mentioned that I was going to have a little challenge for you. So, are you ready?
Yes.
Just while you recover from that shock, I'm going to suggest the following. One positive outcome from the various discourses that are taking place in this decade of anniversaries, commemorations, etc., could be the commissioning of an Irish peace garden, an Irish international peace garden perhaps. Unlike the War Memorial Gardens and the Garden of Remembrance in Parnell Square, both of which have their assigned historical agendas, a peace garden could offer citizens a suitable place to celebrate Ireland's achievements as a peace builder. Just two examples. Next year will mark the 60th anniversary of Ireland's membership of the UN, and 2018 will mark the 50th anniversary of Aiken's ratification of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in Moscow. Precedent for such a garden in Dublin exists in the English city of Sheffield. Owned and managed by the Sheffield City Council, the site contains memorials for Chartist leaders, Sheffielders who died in all the wars, including the Spanish Civil War. It also contains a memorial to Hiroshima, just like Merrion Square does.
How about Dresden?
Yeah. Now, sorry, I'm just about finished. You glad to hear? I just want to make very briefly my conclusions. One, the commissioning of the gardens, as I've detailed, I think, were akin to a joint venture between the committee and the Free State governments to honour Irish participation in the war, not, as claimed by Myers, an official marginalisation. And secondly, the use of the gardens throughout the last 60 years, 70 years, indicates is indicative of the changes in Irish foreign policy? And finally, is there a need for an international peace garden in Ireland? Sinead?
Again, I'd like to thank the organisers of the Grieve School for the invitation to speak here tonight, and I'll get straight into it. Perhaps 40,000 Irish men and women died as a result of the First World War. Thousands more were wounded, and families and communities across this country directly and deeply affected by that conflict. And that alone makes it a hugely significant event in our history, the greatest bloodletting involving Ireland in the 20th century. Indeed, it's impossible, I think, to understand why the Easter Rising occurred and the way that the Irish Revolution developed without reference to the impact of the First World War. So I agree with the historian John Borgonovo, who in his excellent study of Cork during the war years, who has argued that it was the war which fundamentally transformed Ireland in the early years of the 20th century. Wartime censorship and repressive legislation introduced after August 1914 immediately created resentment in Ireland. Anti-war activity was in evidence from a very early stage. Government deficit spending created massive inflation and led to demands for wage rises and hence to strikes. But at the same time, encouragement by the government for wartime arbitration allowed trade unions to grow and benefit. The revival of the Irish Transport Union after 1913, for example, is part of this process. The union begins to grow again during the war. On the land, rents increased and rising food prices hurt farm labourers, encouraging them to join trade unions. And again, by the end of the war, one of the great movements in the Irish countryside is that of farm labourers into the ranks of the Irish Transport Union. And though often forgotten, popular involvement in movements like the People's Food Committees during 1917 did much to radicalise opinion. By the time the British government finally attempted to introduce conscription in 1918, large sections of the Irish population were in open defiance. And I think the war is crucial to all that. And you can't understand what happens after 1918 without reference to the impact of the war. So as a historian, I have no difficulties with researching and discussing World War I, or indeed with its dead being remembered. I understand the very human desire of many to discover more about their ancestors' war service. And furthermore, I think the conflict can be researched and discussed, as a group in Belfast working on the story of the Connacht Rangers in that city have argued, without it being a contribution to the glorification of the senseless slaughter of the First World War. As far back as November 1934, the Republican Congress newspaper asserted that no Irishman objects to the commemoration of those who died in the Great War. But the question, of course, is what kind of commemoration? In 2014, though, I think we have seen commemoration being replaced by celebration and an unquestioning nostalgia about Irish participation in this great slaughter. Now, this is partly because of the influence of moves by the British government and the British establishment to recast the war as a defence of democracy against Prussian militarism, with the strong suggestion that this was simply another form of the Nazism that Britain would fight in the Second World War. This has, of course, involved ignoring or downplaying the nature of the other Allied powers, including Belgium's brutal colonial record in Africa and Tsarist tyranny. But here also in Ireland, I think you also have a number of other aspects. One, because some people sincerely see the war as a tool for reconciliation in the 21st century, while others want to downplay or ignore Ireland's place in the British Empire and act as if there was some mandate for our participation in 1914-1918. The Irish Times editorial on the 4th of August this year, for example, referring to our then government, for example. This is accompanied by a cynical attempt to convince people that the over 200,000 plus Irish people, and not just men, who took part in the war were somehow airbrushed from history on their return. In fact, the RTE website tells us that they were airbrushed from history until this year. Now, as Michael has explained, and as I will also mention, I think this is simply wrong. But it again plays on the genuine interest of many people in their family history. And if you were somebody, a teenager, finding out that your great-grandfather fought in the First World War, and you're also told that nobody could ever talk about that, and this was airbrush, it obviously does have an impact on people. And I think in many ways it's quite cynical, and the truth was obviously more complicated. Finally, commemoration of the war is presented as apolitical and indeed as somehow natural. Why wouldn't we commemorate this great war? Everyone else in Europe does it. In contrast, I want to argue that in fact the war was never forgotten in nationalist Ireland, and of course it wasn't forgotten in Unionist Ireland at all, but people don't usually mention that in this part of the country. But it was remembered in Nationalist Ireland largely as a great waste of life, as a tragic mistake, and as something that the Irish people should not have taken part in. And I think that's the way that it should be remembered. Much of the contemporary commentary on the war is part of an effort to make us see it as something else, as justified in some way. But the state that emerged after 1921, whatever we think of that state or of the Civil War and the nature of the pro- and anti-treaty sides, emerged because of a rejection of empire, inspired to a great degree by revulsion at the war, which discredited British rule in Ireland. Well before the war was over, most Irish people regretted that John Redmond had promised nationalist support for the war effort. As the poem went in 1915, "Full steam ahead," John Redmond said, "and everything is well, chum. Home rule will come when you are dead and buried out in Belgium." Redmond and his party paid the price for this in 1918. And that was reflected in the views of mainstream opinion in this state in the 1920s and 1930s, again, as Michael has mentioned. When there was a discussion in 1926 of establishing a war memorial to the dead of the Great War in Merrion Square, Kevin O'Higgins, the Cumann na Gael minister, strongly objected, even though his own brother had fought in the war. He said, "This state has other origins, and because it has other origins, I do not wish to see it suggested in stone or otherwise that it has that origin." So again, there was a strong element in Cumann na Gael who were certainly opposed to a commemoration of the war on the doorstep of Leinster House. And I'll come back to this again. But there's also another question which somehow eludes a lot of the commentary on the war these days. Why exactly were Irishmen fighting in British Army uniform? And the question and the answer may seem obvious, but it's often overlooked in mainstream commentary. Irishmen went to war in 1914 as part of the British military machine because of decisions made in London. There was no even partially independent Irish Parliament in Dublin to rubber stamp our participation. Even if there had been, I think opposing the war would have been right. But given that there wasn't even that fig leaf of democracy, all discussion of Ireland's participation should reference this at the start, and it very often doesn't. And yes, of course, Irishmen had participated in the British military for generations. But what exactly did that mean? And again, there often seems to be an unwillingness to discuss this. It meant holding the empire by oppressing its subjects. As a future president of this state, Sean T. O'Kelly, put it to a meeting of Indian nationalists in New York during 1924, "We the Irish must feel under deep obligation to work for India and for Egypt until both are free. We owe a deep debt to these countries, for has it not been largely by the work of Irish brains and Irish brawn and muscle that these two ancient peoples have been beaten into subjection and have been so long oppressed? Our Indian friends could, if they wished, tell us many heart-rending stories of the brutalities practised upon their peoples by English regiments bearing names such as Connaught Rangers, Munster Fusiliers, Dublin Fusiliers. Egypt has the same sad stories to tell, to our disgrace. Until we Irish do something practical to make amends for the wrongdoing, that shame will rest with us." Now, both Kevin O'Higgins' views and Sean T. O'Kelly's views were mainstream views, certainly in the 1920s and 1930s. There was nothing to be proud of about Irish participation in the British military historically. And even if we can make a case for a slight difference in recruitment during the Great War, the Munster Fusiliers and the Royal Dublin Fusiliers and those regiments earned their spurs putting down people in India and Africa and the rest of the empire. And that's something that we should also mention whenever we discuss this. But can we commemorate the war and those who took part? And again, we have to ask then, why exactly did these people take part, over 200,000 of them? It's tempting, I think, and satisfying in some ways to charge that John Redmond and the Home Rule Party was responsible for their participation and the resulting losses. But I would counsel caution, because despite his own efforts, and despite his own efforts, argue against conflating with John Redmond with John Bruton. Because if we think Nationalist Ireland essentially supported a version of John Bruton's politics in 1914, or that we imagine the Home Rulers were essentially another version of Unionists, then I don't think we can understand why by 1918 people had endorsed the idea of independence. So I think it is worthwhile examining what exactly the Home Rule movement stood for, and why, when it turned in 1914 to support the British war effort, why this was a great shock to many people, and why disillusion with it set in very quickly. This is John Redmond in 1892 addressing a rally in Waterford, calling for the release of Fenian prisoners in Britain. He says, "They are our kith and kin. They are men who sacrificed everything that was most dear to them in an effort to benefit Ireland. What do we care whether their effort was a wise one or not, whether a mistaken one or not? Throughout the 1890s, Redmond regularly visited Republican prisoners in England and acted as a legal advisor to them. When in 1897 Tom Clarke was released from prison, he expressly singled out Redmond for his efforts, which Clarke said meant a great deal to us. As far as I'm concerned, I felt the good effects of his visits for a week afterwards, and sometimes for a fortnight. Clarke's Welcome Home rally was chaired by Redmond's brother William, MP for East Clare. William Redmond had been jailed twice during the Land War and would again be jailed in 1902 for attempting to prevent an eviction. During the Boer War, he was treasurer of the Irish Transvaal Committee, opposing the British war effort and recruiting in Ireland. During May 1899, John Redmond and his deputy John Dillon both provided references for Tom Clarke when he sought a position as a clerk with Rathdown Poor Law Union. Praising Clarke's character and abilities, Redmond told his potential employers that he held the Fenian in the feelings of greatest respect and goodwill. Now, I'm not aware of John Bruton's record in the same endeavour. So I think it's important not to look at this through the prism of 2014, but to actually look back at why, what the politics of Home Rule represented to many people. We are, of course, more familiar with later versions of the Redmond brothers, with John Redmond arguing that Home Rule would guarantee Britain a loyal friend within the Empire, and William Redmond dying in British Army uniform in 1917. But the movement that John Redmond led was an Irish nationalist movement, whose anthem was A Nation Once Again. And one of the contradictions of Home Rule is that many supporters of the party expected it to mean far more than it would have in practice. John Redmond's professions of imperial loyalty were real, although they were sometimes exaggerated to impress a deeply suspicious British audience. But this loyalty was not necessarily felt by many of the party's supporters. It might surprise some that perhaps a quarter of Home Rule MPs in the early 1900s were ex-members of the IRB. And this wasn't a secret because the party regularly trumpeted its radical past. It was the Home Rule Party which monopolised the Manchester Martyr commemorations every year. They portrayed themselves as the inheritors of that tradition. As Willie Redmond asserted in 1910, under Home Rule the aspirations of our race will be realised and the struggle of the men of 98, of 67 and 48 will be rewarded. Nor did the party endorse recruiting for the British Army in Ireland. As William Delaney, the MP for Kilkenny, put it in 1905, if you joined the army, they would send you out to fight for the great British Empire, and afterwards you'd get 2 pewter medals and 6pence a day for 5 years, and you'd die in the workhouse. Hence, in 1914, unlike many Tories, Liberals, and even Labour MPs, very few Home Rulers in Westminster had to worry about being called up as reservists, because most Home Rule MPs had never served in the British Army, unlike many of their British contemporaries. At various stages, Tomás MacDonagh, Joseph Mary Plunkett, Rory O'Connor, Sean McKeown, Patrick Little, Francis and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington had been members of various branches of the Home Rule Party, while Sean McDiarmid was a member of the Ancient Order of Hibernians until 1906. The distinctions between constitutionalists and separatists were often blurred before 1914, and Home Rule rhetoric about Cromwell's work being nearly undone conjured up visions of much more than limited devolution within the empire. This is not to ignore the often deeply reactionary aspects of the party, such as its role during the lockout or its position on women's suffrage, but to try and understand them in the context of their time and what this says about what their call for support for the war effort means in 1914. But again, to return to Redmond. Before Redmond said anything at all about the matter, there were already 50,000 Irish men in British uniforms in 1914 who were already serving in the military. And when the war began, the thousands who were initially back in uniform are former soldiers, reservists. These include, as you'll probably know, at least 1,000 members of the Irish Transport Union, among them members of the Citizen Army. As the Irish Worker lamented, some of our best comrades are leaving the North Wall to fight for the glory of England. These men didn't volunteer, essentially, they were called back up because they were ex-soldiers. Around 26,000 Ulster volunteers also join up in 1914 and 1915, as do thousands of other men from unionist backgrounds from across Ireland. And Redmond can't essentially be blamed for that because Irish unionists were going to support the war effort no matter what he said. Now, about 24,000 members of the Irish Volunteers do join up, most of them probably after Redmond's famous speech at Woodenbridge. And some nationalists did accept Redmond's reasoning for supporting the war. The former MP Tom Kettle, for example, who's been mentioned, argued that this war is without parallel. France is as right now as she was wrong in 1870. England is as right now as she was wrong in the Boer War, and Russia is as right now as she was wrong on Bloody Sunday, 1905. Kettle enlisted in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers and of course was killed in 1916. We've had reference to Francis Ledwidge. Ledwidge, a founder of the County Meath Labour Union, was an early recruit to the Irish Volunteers in Slane and initially supported Owen MacNeill's anti-war faction of the Volunteers. But he joined the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers later in 1914 for whatever reason. But his own explanation was, I joined the British Army because she stood between Ireland and an enemy common to our civilization, and I would not let her have her say that she defended us while we did nothing at home but pass resolutions. Ledwidge, of course, is also killed in 1917. Now, Kettle had been in Belgium buying guns for the Irish Volunteers when war broke out, and he'd witnessed the effect of the German invasion at first hand. And certainly reports of German atrocities and also pro-war propaganda are very important in explaining why people join up in the winter of 1914. This mood also sees attacks on German shopkeepers and businesses in Dublin and the arrests of foreigners in Ireland accused of being spies. But analysing the reasons why the majority of Irish men, most of whom were not members of the Irish Volunteers or the Ulster Volunteers, joined up is more difficult. How many were like Tom Barry from Cork, who reflected that, I cannot plead that I went on the advice of John Redmond or any other politician, that if we fought for the British that we would secure home rule for Ireland, nor can I say I understood what home rule meant. I was not influenced by the lurid appeal to save Belgium or small nations. I knew nothing about nations, large or small. I went to war for no other reason than to see what war was like, to get a gun, to see new countries, and to feel a grown man. And unfortunately, that emotion among young men isn't any lesser 100 years on in terms of why they might want to join military organisations or armies. And here we can discuss class and economic pressure and political pressure as well, such as when the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin extorted Irish women to shun those who would not volunteer for service, to visit them with severest disapproval, and when they expect a smile, just look them straight in the face and turn away. An Irish version of the famous White Feather campaign in Britain. There were also, of course, family and community loyalties, the impact of war propaganda, and a desire for adventure. I'd like to talk more about the divisions within working class attitudes to the war in Ireland, particularly the role of the so-called separation women, for example, but time is limited. I hope to talk more about it at the, I'll be speaking on a similar subject at the Smithfield and Stony Batter History Festival later this month. But of course, this does make the idea of commemoration very complicated, because what exactly are we commemorating about these men and indeed women? Many Irish war veterans were proud of their service, proud of what they and their friends had been through together, and they retained a sense of comradeship right into their old age. But certainly in much of Ireland, this did not necessarily mean that they identified with support for Britain. The Ex-Servicemen's Association in Cork, for instance, Cork City, founded after the war, set up their own organisation in order to be independent of the British Legion. Their demonstrations during 1920 were often stewarded by Republican police, and during that year they were involved in bloody rioting against the British Army after one of their members was shot dead by troops. During July 1919, 2,000 to 3,000 members of the Irish Nationalist Veterans Association met in Dublin's Mansion House to call for a boycott of the city's victory parade. They were addressed by Tom Kettle's widow, Mary, who questioned why soldiers were asked to march past College Green, their own House of Parliament, where their rights had been bartered away, to salute Lord French, not as an Irish soldier but as Lord Lieutenant and head of the Irish Executive, which was responsible for the rule of coercion in this country and for the betrayal of every Irish nationalist soldier who fought and fell in the war. Did any Irish nationalist fight for any country except the country of his birth? Cries of no, no. Kettle hoped, in honour of her husband's memory, not a single Dublin Fusilier would march in the procession. If it had brought about an Irish settlement, they would march proudly. Such was not the case, but on the contrary, they were asked to join and unite with the Army of Occupation. Now, Tom Kettle's death in the war is often held up as an example, as emblematic of Irish participation, but his widow's words in 1919 are much less well known. Some ex-soldiers went further, of course. Tom Barry, Emmett Dalton, and several hundred less well-known men became involved in various aspects of the IRA's war for independence. Joseph O'Sullivan joined the Munster Fusiliers in January 1915 and lost a leg at Ypres. Reginald Dunn joined the Irish Guards in June 1916. In 1922, they shot dead Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, himself an Irish war veteran of course, outside his home in London. Both men were captured and hanged a month later. Dunn told the court that we both joined the British Army voluntarily for the purpose of taking human life, in order that the principles for which this country stood should be upheld and preserved. These principles, we were told, were self-determination and freedom for small nations. We came back from France to find that self-determination had been given to some nations we had never heard of, but it had been denied to Ireland. The experience of other veterans was different. Sergeant Patrick O'Hare from Belfast was a career soldier with 16 years service in the Connacht Rangers, including during the First World War. In July 1921, O'Hare and his family were driven from their home in Erney Street at gunpoint by a loyalist mob. Despite being in British Army uniform at the time, O'Hare was told he was going to be shot and his family were forced to leave that area. The likelihood is many of the loyalists forcing him from his home were also veterans of the First World War. Ex-servicemen were prominent in the violence in Belfast from 1920 to 22 as IRA members, as nationalist vigilantes, as members of loyalist death squads, as special constables, as policemen, and also back in uniform as British soldiers. Indeed, one of the ways in which unionist politicians stirred up tension among the workforce was to claim that Protestant ex-servicemen had lost their jobs during the war to disloyal Sinn Féiners. This again is part of the post-war experience for ex-servicemen, but how exactly do we commemorate that? There were, of course, other ex-servicemen in Ireland in those years who were quite well known, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. Pádraig O'Rourke has written a history of Clare during that period, and he's one of the few people to try and list the number of locally recruited Black and Tans and auxiliaries. That is, men from County Clare who joined these forces. And he's found they were over 60, almost all Catholic ex-servicemen, war veterans. As at least 1,000 Black and Tans and auxiliaries were recruited in Ireland, we can be sure that most of these men were war veterans. So again, how exactly do we commemorate their service and their record after the war? During the war itself, the War of Independence that is, some ex-servicemen were killed by the IRA as informers, and some were killed by Crown forces. Some were involved in labour and land agitation, and some were landowners and employers themselves. Some remained supportive of the Home Rule Party and its successor groups well into the 1920s, while very many probably kept their heads down and got on with their lives. The 200,000 or so war veterans were divided by politics, religion and class, as of course they naturally would be. Then of course we have another war, the Civil War from 1922 to 23. Up to 30% of the new Free State Army were ex-British soldiers, mostly war veterans, and they were key to the organisation of the Free State Army in military terms in the early stages of the war. The Free State Army also recruited heavily from towns where the British Army had traditionally drawn many of their soldiers. Their presence, of course, was noted by anti-treaty propaganda, though in fact most of the worst atrocities that the Free State carried out were actually carried out by the core group who'd been around Michael Collins rather than ex-British soldiers. But there were also still ex-British soldiers on the anti-treaty side, and pro-treaty propagandists were also quick to point that out during the Civil War. But of course what this illustrates is that there's no apolitical or value-free way in commemorating the men who served during the First World War, or anyone involved in that war at all. Asserting that the war was forgotten also means ignoring the huge commemorations, which Michael mentioned, up to 40,000 strong, that took place every year in Dublin and some other towns until 1939. Certainly in the 1920s, the commemorations on the 11th of November in Dublin involved thousands of ordinary ex-servicemen. But they were highly political unionist demonstrations, bedecked in poppies and Union Jacks, and therefore were always contentious. As senior Gardaí argued at the time, the ceremonies were a regular field day for these persons. If the irregulars, the IRA, adopted such tactics, they would be arrested under the Treasonable Offences Act. Another Garda complained that the commemorations were in fact an occasion for anti-Irish and pro-British sentiments, and he urged the government to ban these ceremonies on the 11th of November. The two Gardaí concerned were David Nelligan and Ono Duffy, again hardly regarded as rabid Republicans now, but both of whom were angry at what they saw as the pro-British nature of these commemorations. So again, how do you discuss this commemoration in Dublin without referring to this? So how do we commemorate? Well, I think remember, but remember with rage. Identify with those who opposed the war and pointed out the horror that was coming. Point out the scale and nature of anti-war activity across Europe in 1914, and also look at that war activity in Ireland in 1914 and 1915. By 1915, particularly after Gallipoli, and Gallipoli in Dublin in many ways is Dublin's Somme in terms of the impact it has in terms of casualties. Disillusionment is growing rapidly in the city by that point. In November 1915, Dublin Corporation votes by a large majority to resist any attempt to introduce conscription. And in Ireland, we can actually point to a concrete example of how lives were saved by anti-war agitation: the anti-conscription strike of April 1918. Had conscription not been stopped, several thousand more Irishmen certainly would have died at the front in the summer of 1918. On the 20th of April 1918, 1,500 delegates at a special Labour convention in Dublin backed a call for a general strike. This was organised within 3 days. Rapidly organised despite press censorship, and in most of the country, only banks, law courts and government offices stayed open. It was a huge success. As even the Irish Times admitted, it was the voice of Labour, not the voice of religion or politics, which yesterday stopped the wheels of industry. We think that April 23rd will be chiefly remembered not as the day when Nationalist Ireland proclaimed her spiritual and moral isolation, but as the day when Labour found itself. And I think if there is one event during the war worth commemorating, and there are others of course, certainly one is the general strike of 1918, which does save lives, no question about that. We can also look at how the Republican Congress in the 1930s commemorated the war. In November 1934 and 1935, they organised alternative anti-imperialist commemorations in Dublin, under slogans such as "Honour the dead by fighting for the living," "We want war on the slums," "Freedom for this small nation," and "Provision of decent homes and livelihoods for ex-servicemen and all Irish workers." War veterans, Republicans and Socialists presented an alternative to the British Legion's commemorations and the increasingly sterile IRA disruption of them. The Republican Congress argued that war commemoration was valid, but they should be commemorations led by the betrayed and the exploited, and not a demonstration to perpetuate human slaughter. Frank Ryan, a veteran of the IRA's campaigns to disrupt Poppy Day in the 20s, described 1934 as the proudest of all armistice days for me. And again, that is a tradition that we can think about in terms of how we remember the war. And finally, I think we need to be prepared to discuss the politics of the war, and that includes the politics of those who opposed it, including James Connolly. How much time have I got? There remains a good deal of confusion about what Irish opponents of the war actually said, and some of the promoters of Great War nostalgia, of the Great War Nostalgia Fest in this country, are eager to point out the alliance between the rebels in 1916 and our gallant allies in Europe. Now, I'm actually fairly unexercised about the fact of this, because I think it was a fact. I think it would be completely logical if the powers that be were going down the road of inviting British royals to the GPO, that they also invite German, Austrian, Hungarian and Turkish government representatives as well. But some people still seem very uneasy about acknowledging the fact that the rebels did in fact ally themselves with the Central Powers. That phrase in the proclamation isn't there to fill space. It was written in the belief that the Central Powers would win the war, and in their reshaping of a new Europe would include an independent Ireland. This was of course a huge hostage to fortune, and it would haunt Sinn Féin in 1919 when it sought admittance to the Versailles post-war conference, and also when De Valera went to the United States to argue for recognition of the Republic. It's constantly thrown back at them: didn't you support the Germans in the war, the losers? But the idea of a successful rebellion in 1916 was predicated on German aid. In 1915, Roger Casement and Joseph Mary Plunkett had presented their Ireland report to the Germans, arguing for a naval landing of at least 12,000 German troops in the west of Ireland and a much greater supply of arms and ammunition to enable the volunteers to hold the line from Limerick to Athlone. How seriously the Germans took the plan is open to question, but the assertion by the leadership of the Military Council of the IRB within Ireland that German aid was on its way was crucial to convincing waverers in the run-up to 1916. And during the fighting in Dublin itself again, the belief that the Germans had in fact landed was key to keeping up the morale of the rank-and-file fighters who did believe that the Germans were on their way. Most Irish separatists were anti-imperialist as far as Britain was concerned, but they were less interested in imperialism elsewhere. The Citizen Army could sing "The Germans are winning the war, me boys" on their route marches without any consideration of what the Germans winning the war might mean. The main concern of Irish separatists, naturally enough, was with the imperialism that they were fighting. And this makes perfect sense to me. I don't agree with some of it, and I think in retrospect we should consider what Ireland's place would have been within a German-dominated imperial system had Germany won the war. I think that would have implications for any idea of an independent foreign policy. But I don't see any point in denying this was what many Irish Republicans and separatists believed in 1916. And similarly, I think we have to go beyond reducing James Connolly's position on the war to the admittedly brilliant slogan, neither king nor Kaiser. I think we're doing him a disservice if that's what we say Connolly taught. I said this at the Grief School in 2005, so some of you will already have heard it. But Connolly's position on the war changed fairly rapidly from August, when there is utter despair at the collapse of European socialist parties into support for their various nation states' war efforts, to by 1915 not just support, but apologia for Imperial Germany. Again, there are concrete reasons for many of the assertions Connolly makes, but they end up being support not for the German anti-war left, but for the pro-war right-wing German Social Democrats. So Connolly lamented in August 1914, "War is upon us and we are helpless. What becomes of all our protests of fraternisation, all our threats of general strikes, all our carefully built machinery of internationalism, all our hopes for the future? Were they all as sound and fury, signifying nothing?" And of course, it must have seemed that they were signifying nothing at that point. By the end of August, Connolly is arguing that Britain has gone to war to kill off the flower of the manhood of the three most civilised nations in Europe, to place the iron heel of the Russian tyrant upon the throat of all liberty-loving races and peoples from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and invite the blessing of God upon the spectacle of the savage Cossack ravaging the daughters of a race at the head of Christian civilization. And there's no doubt from then on that Connolly not only desires a German victory over Britain, which again is fairly logical, but eulogises Imperial Germany as a modern progressive state and plays down any reactionary aspects of German imperialism. So when Connolly asserted that Germany contained the best educated working class in the world, the greatest number of labour papers, the greatest number of parliamentary and local representatives, the greatest number of socialist voters, what he was saying was true, but these had been built in opposition to the Imperial German state that he was hoping would win the war. He also argued, of course, that the Germans were a civilised people who respond to every progressive influence, whereas the Russian Empire stretches away into the depths of Asia and relies upon an army largely recruited from amongst many thousands of barbarians who have not yet felt the first softening influence of civilization. He suggested that the German Empire, in comparison to the British, was a homogeneous empire of self-governing peoples, something which the Herero people of Southwest Africa might have found surprising. In December 1915, the Workers' Republic republished an interview with Kaiser Wilhelm, in which the Kaiser was alleged to have described German socialists as splendid fellows and the writer of the article asserted, "There is no doubt that the Kaiser understands the aims of the radical left in Parliament far better and has more sympathies for them than the world knows." Now, of course, this is nonsense. The Kaiser had spent most of his life pondering how to crush German socialism. But the fact that Connolly thought it worthwhile republishing it illustrates that I think Desmond Ryan was correct when he describes Connolly in that period as embittered, horrified and depressed, and filled with profound and proud despair. However, there is absolutely nothing of this in Desmond Grieve's biography of Connolly. He ignores Connolly's eulogisation of Imperial Germany completely. And I think that does a disservice to a discussion of Connolly and his politics. And a century on, we should certainly be able to discuss this. In order to honestly counter the war nostalgia which has become part of remembrance of the war in Ireland, I think we also have to be honest about our own history. Thank you.
On that note, we'll wrap up. I'd just like to thank all our speakers, Brian Hanley on my left here, and Michael Quinn. And I'd like to thank you, the audience in particular, those of you who made a contribution from the floor. Just thought it may be of interest to you, we have a series of history and head schools on the war coming up. If you want more discussion, next one will be in part of the Dublin History Festival in Dublin Castle on the 27th of September. We're going down to Limerick then on the 9th of October, looking at the period in Limerick. And then on Tuesday, the 25th of November, we're going to look at Dublin at war, focusing on the Dublin experience. And then on the 9th of November, we're going up to my native Ballyshannon, and we're looking at the Northwest at war. So we're looking at it from different angles, different panels, and I expect, as is always the case, each discussion is entirely different. So I look forward to seeing you at some of those down the line. Thank you very much.